great.
I think we can grab that shirt over there.
Go ahead. Oh, I really need to even sit up there, but.
What's that?
And this is Lindsay Carlson.
Hi, Lindsay.
Really? What was your name?
Pam Rouser.
Okay.
No, he's still hanging out at the office.
Is he good?
I tried to kick him out, I think. So, let's see, we have some copies. This is an audit update.
Yes,
The weed department.
yes. And so these are the draft of the, what the reports will be.
Okay. Yes, does anyone else need?
Yeah, me too.
Mhm. So I'll kind of let Lindsay go over the report, but what we did, just so you guys are aware, is we have the official report, which is what you guys have, and then we have kind of a memo that we also give to Scott, that he's, can share with you if you need it, but it has a lot more of the detail behind it, so it's to not clutter this report, we typically just give it to like a memo of management, so they know the specifics of everything that we saw. So
Okay.
I wanted to make you guys aware of that when you guys are looking at this, to understand where some of the specifics are ironed out.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the beginning part of the report, and under the procedures is what you asked us to look at in the agreed upon procedures. Basically, we looked through those grants that are listed there, and you can see that we wrote out where the findings were, so you can match up which ones go with which grant and which procedures. So this, as Angie said, this one has a little less detail than what's gonna be in the memo for Scott. But you're welcome to look at the detail as well. And then, so we could just go through each one if you want. Did you guys have a chance to speak through it?
No, we just got it.
Okay. So in that first finding, there were 10 instances spread throughout the different grants. It actually applies to all three of the grants that we looked at with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the Missouri River ones, and then those MDA grants. There were 10 instances where the expenditures weren't matched up with revenues that were received in those funds. See, and the recommendation we made was just to, in the future, make sure that those expenses are being matched in the appropriate fund where they go with revenues. That second finding, is related to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. We found that there were 2 grant expenditures that, were incurred outside of the grant period. That was for one of the grants back in 2009.
That's before Scott was even here.
Yes, and a lot of these actually relate to stuff that happened before Scott was here, so he really had no control over a lot of that stuff. So, but it is something that we found when we looked through it, so we to bring it to everyone's attention. So it's kind of something going forward, we can keep an eye on, make sure it doesn't happen again. So those actually, he will need to contact Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to let them know that those expenses were outside the grant and see what they want to do about that. Since there was a specific date on those grants, and so that all the expenses needed to be within that time period. The third one is something that Scott had already pointed out to us when MDA had come in and they've gone through the expenses and adjusted some items, and so you weren't fully reimbursed for some of the expenses due to the grant agreement. But the way that the expenses were paid, it could have been paid with restricted funds. We weren't able to identify whether they were paid with restricted funds or not, but it's the way that the cash account is set up. It's hard to track your noxious weed funds, it's hard to track the other types of funds that you receive, and those noxious weed funds can only be used to pay for certain expenses, so it's something that going forward should probably be tracked in a different way, so you make sure that if you do overspend a grant or something can't be reimbursed, that funds don't get used inappropriately. The fourth finding is mostly about the grant files, and these are definitely prior to Scott's time. A lot of those Rocky Mountain Elk Foundations, the original award letters weren't part of the file, so it was hard for us to tell what the project number even was, what the grant periods were. We had to request some information from Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to even establish what those parameters were, so that's something to keep track of going forward. The grant files contain all the information to make it easier to make sure you spend or get reimbursed for what you are allowed, those types of things. The fifth finding is about separating grants by different categories in the, it's mostly to do with how it's in the accounting records in the general ledger. Grants should be recorded, each one should be recorded separately, because it has a different grant year. Some of them are 2 years, some of them are 1 year. They often do not follow the county's fiscal year, so to be able to track your expenses appropriately, it would help a lot if each grant had its own kind of account line. And the last one, Scott, or you guys had asked us to look at the cash to determine if the cash on hand was reconciled. And the same 10 expenses that we noted in finding 1 relate to the cash balance as well. There's some internal expenses that weren't matched with the revenue, and so the cash balance could be incorrect, but we couldn't find enough support for those internal expenses as to which fund they originated in. So they're sitting in the 2840 fund, the weed department fund, but the revenue is sitting there for the expenses. Not sure where they originated, so the cash balance, as far as we can tell, is fairly accurate, but there could be some that needs to be moved from one fund to the other. So each of those findings does have a recommendation that you can see in there. Does anyone have any questions?
Franklin, any questions?
No.
I guess I would like to see somewhere that it says that this was, a lot of this was incurred before Scott ever came on.
Okay.
Because somebody reading it is gonna take it that Scott did this. That's not true. So I would like it to say somewhere here that many of these occurred before he came about.
Okay.
Maybe add on each of the findings, kind of the timeline of the dates of when
Mhm.
they occurred. You know, like on finding 1, there were 10 of them, we can say 8 of them were incurred prior to this date, or things like that, something like that, so that way it's a
So
little
it's
bit more
clear.
specific. Okay.
Does the memo have the year on it?
Actually, it
does in
gives
some of them.
the grant project number, and some of them do have the dates, like the one expense was incurred in 2009. I did note that in the detail here, and I think on one of these, in the detail, it noted that they were prior to the current.
I guess, and I do have one more request, is that it tells his date of hire,
Okay.
so it makes it clear. I guess it's just a CYA for you, Scott, that,
Yeah, I kind of agree, and I think it notes in the draft, but something I wanted to point out too, when she was talking about the breaking up of the grants, each individual, if you look under finding number 5, what she's specifically talking about is, up to this point, all Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation grants have been categorized as one grant. There's been no separation of those funds, which has made it an absolute nightmare for us to try to track the expenses, and to me, that's kind of a big concern, and we need to be able to move forward. And, I mean, there was, I don't know, I think there was one or two that were open about the same time, completely different. One was up for the North Elkhorns, one was for the South Elkhorns, completely different grants, but they were all lumped under one category, so.
And for the other grants, like the MDA grants actually were in the ledger like that. They had their separate project numbers, so they had actually separate account number, like a 551, 552, but all the Rocky Mountain Elk ones were lumped together. There's been 4 different grants since 2007, but no change in account numbers, which makes it really hard to match things up with grant periods. So that is how you could get expenses that were incurred outside the grant year being submitted for reimbursement. So to avoid that going forward, definitely every time you get a grant, it needs to have a separate GL account number, so that all the expenses just for that can go there. Expenses for the other one can go in a different spot.
And Jim, I do have one more question. What does MDA stand for?
Those are the
Montana Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
And we can spell out the MDA as Montana Department of Agriculture.
According to this, you say this was not an audit.
No, it is not. An audit, it's what's considered agreed upon procedures. It's terminology, accounting terminology is a lot different than most people think of it. If we did an audit, it would have to be, I mean, you'd have to have pretty much a full county audit. It wouldn't get you what you want, because what you were looking for was for us to look at specific things. And so you have to be very careful when you, because even though from an outside perspective, it's kind of termed an audit, for GAAP purposes, the general accepting accounting, standards or anything, you we technically can't call it an audit. So, and that is why it notes in that first paragraph that it's not actually an audit, but an agreed upon procedure, which is much less costly, much more to the point, specific, what you needed.
Does that help, Franklin? One of the things that I think would help too is to have a copy of the memo, just for the detail.
And I can give you guys this copy, and then
Oh,
you
thank
can email
you.
if you guys want, you can you guys copy that, or
Okay,
we can send some extra ones to get copied as well.
thank you very much. So the difference between Rocky Mountain and Department of Ag having their own line items and own tracking records, was that something that was required by MDA and that's why it was done differently, or do you guys have any clue from looking at what you were looking at?
All of them had separate ones except for Rocky Mountain, so I'm not really sure why.
Okay.
The Missouri River, there's more than one of those grants as well. They were separated by location. The central Elkhorns and then the you can see that on the memo actually, if you look down. So MDA, there's a little Mountain one, which is C, and then D, the MDA, North Elkhorns, those were each separate accounts. Then the 2 Missouri River ones were separated in their own accounts, but every time you would see a reference to Rocky Mountain Health Foundation, they were just lumped together. They weren't ever separated, even though there were different projects, different years, worked together.
And since that was prior to Scott, I mean, it could have been how the person before him wanted it done, it could have been something done on, just the accounting side for some reason, but we couldn't see any evidence that told us why they went one way with one and not splitting them out like they
Yes.
My guess is MDA Missouri, where the RAC are government entities, Rocky Mountain Plantation is not.
That could be why.
Oh,
What was your date of hire, Scott? Can you remind me?
July 18th, 2011. There is one expense or one discrepancy or whatever that I think I noted that was after my hire. And that was under F, was 184. And that was one of the ones that I closed out that was actually an extension from hire date. It was supposed to be closed out the year that I was hired, but it was an extension, and that actually occurred, that was something I had nothing to do with really, the 286, and even though that one was, showed after my hire date, that had already been incurred prior to, I believe. I mean, it was just found upon the finalizing of the grant.
And there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with those expenses. I mean, you were allowed to charge those grants for administrative expenses. It was that the expense was never recorded in the same fund as the revenue. So the revenue came in, but there's no expense matching up with that. The expense was for administrative. I'm not sure what made up those administrative. It could be the phone bill for his office, or it could be any number of things, which he's allowed to charge the grant for. There's no problems there. It's just that the expense is sitting over here and the revenue is sitting over here, and we should have been together.
Typically, the expense that you know that you're gonna charge would get moved over for that amount to match it.
sure. Scott, any other observations from your point of view? Anything else you want to point out?
Well, I think that the only other one that I could see was kind of in the cash reserves, and I've got some questions that I will just kind of pull these ladies off to the side and talk to them about, but, some cash balances, just kind of on the separation of funds or whatever, because I was just dealing with one this morning. I have a receipt from Department of Ag. It's put under the noxious weed trust funds. That's how it's been, deposited as a revenue under that, but it's a different one. But kind of in the way that I've got showed that revenue goes under that same general noxious weed trust fund. And so now it's kind of, okay, how can we move forward so that this doesn't all keep getting lumped together, so that we can track these in case, these expenses occur that are outside them noxious weed trust fund specifications or, certain things like that.
Sure.
And from an accounting standpoint, one thing that would help with the cash balances that I noticed is that a lot of the deposits weren't recorded the same way each time, so they kind of got a different description in there, which makes it a lot harder to track what actually is your noxious weed trust fund money, and what's your other fund that you have. So being consistent is really important in this kind of thing, where if all your cash is lumped into one fund, it should be really consistent as to how each of the deposits are labeled, so it's the same.
Especially when you start getting into having, multiple grants going at the same time, what deposits are for what, it can get, just looking into the general ledger, it could be tricky trying to figure out what that's for and what it relates to. And to have to, just look at this one and say, well, we can't tell from the description, then having to go back and, pull deposit slips or looking at bank statements, things like that, it could end up creating a whole process.
Yes.
To say the least.
Yes.
One thing I would like to jump into and say too real quick is all these findings were performed, finishing at fiscal year end, our fiscal year end in July 30th or whatever of 2012. So anything from that date forward was not part of this procedure. So anything was found anything that was found was from July 30th, 2012, dating back.
Okay.
That person might mention that in this too, that you, in a letter or whatever,
The current fiscal year for the county hasn't been, the books haven't been closed out, so we couldn't look at your cash balance from 2012 to 2013. Because if it hasn't been closed out, there could still be things affecting the balance that we would know from when we stopped to when we gave this report.
Sure.
Cut it off, so.
So we can figure out where in the report, but we'll somewhere put the timeline of what this was from.
Okay,
To kind of make that a little bit more, clarity, yes.
very good.
That's why we like to bring these to you guys in a draft form, so you can, you know, because you guys always have a little bit more intimate knowledge of what you want to see and, you know, if there's things that specifically you want pointed out. So, and that's the other nice thing about when you do agreed upon procedures is you can have a little bit more leeway with what goes in the report and some of the wording. Whereas audits is like, no, it says exactly this. There's no changes.
Sure, that makes sense. You guys were here, what, in October or November?
It was cold is all I remember. It was November, correct, yes.
Cold, could be today.
Yeah,
Could be June.
That's true, in Montana.
Yes.
well, it'll be good to just kind of absorb this.
And what our thoughts are, and if we can do one of any ways, depending on what you guys want, is we can leave these with you to review, then if you have questions and stuff, come back and let us know. So we don't have to finalize the report today, obviously. We can wait, and then whatever day you guys agree on, changes, you know, we can go through and add, our changes. We can get them to Scott, and then you guys can review, with the changes that we have. Or we can hold off and wait another week if you guys think you might have more questions or things you want, worded differently or anything like that. And then we can send you a new draft. And then from that point decide, you know, if that's what you want to have as your final, draft. The other thing that you guys, can do, and this is, your decision, is whether or not you guys, under each recommendation, whether you guys want to respond to the recommendations. You can put your responses in this report. So it would say, you know, finding one, and then recommendation, and then you can have a response, and it would just say management response. And then Scott would have the opportunity to respond there as well. You can do that, or you can leave it without responses. It's, completely up to, you guys for that.
Okay.
So that is something that you guys can add if you'd like.
What do you think, Scott? Would you want the opportunity to have some responses, or do you think that that's not necessary for your purposes?
You know, like I said, the main thing that I wanted to point out was that everything, pretty much all these findings, you know, came before I was even in here,
Yeah.
you know. So I think that's the only response I really have.
And this might give them more opportunity to make it a little bit more obvious to
Right.
that. You know, even if we put it in one sentence somewhere in here, it might still get missed by somebody looking at the report. But if in his responses, he can note in a little more detail of, you know, how he wants to respond, that they were done prior to his, arrival, that he can do that as well.
Okay. Yeah, the response could be very short, just reiterating
It
that
can be one
date.
sentence, yeah.
Mhm.
Anything, you know, the responses are completely up to you. Typically, if responses get added and we don't change the wording in them or anything, it's truly your response. So whatever you guys tell us to put in there is what we would put. And then once we got those responses, that would be kind of the day we typically consider the report to be, you know, the final date, that we would date it. And then we would, send a letter that, Scott would sign, what's called a management representation letter, basically just saying that, you know, he gave us everything that we asked for, and that everything kind of went as planned and all that. And then once we get that signed back, then we can give final reports.
That would be a good place too, I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, to put something like, almost like a goal list. All right, so we'll take this information, the findings, and the recommendation, and the response is, we are working on, or we have set up individual funds for each of these Rocky Mountain grants, so that there's a paper trail of, actually following those recommendations.
Exactly, yes.
Okay,
Yeah, that's typically, you know, when things like where the one where it says, you know, we recommend you contact Rocky Mountain Rec Foundation. Then the response can be that either we already contacted them and here's the result, or we are planning on contacting, things like that.
which would be good for the records to have that in black and white also.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So if you
Yeah.
guys would like to do that, what we can do is send you basically a Word document of this report. And then you can add your responses, and we'll put the lines in there, you know, management response, and then you can add your lines directly right in there and send it back to us.
I've already got that copy in the email.
Oh, okay,
I think that's where I printed these off of, but, that
Okay.
would work for me. I would make one suggestion that if we're gonna go forward, any comments from you folks, anything, be turned into me, by Thursday. That way, I'm gonna be gone next week, pretty much at annual conference and out of the office for most of the week, so, if I could have them turned in by Thursday, then, I can get them back to them in a timely fashion.
Is that doable?
It is.
All right, we will do that, Thursday by noon.
Okay? And
How's
that'll
that? That gives you some hours
work.
to,
And it'll work, and then I'll get this forwarded. Is that okay to forward the email that you sent to me earlier?
I think so, yeah,
Okay.
that should work. And if for some reason we can't format in that one or anything, let me know, and
Okay.
we can work from there.
I messed around with it a little bit. I don't know if I can, I'm
Okay.
pretty sure I can forward it, and so, no problem.
excellent. Doug, do you have you seen this already?
I haven't seen it yet, I just, Scott came in with some of it, this morning, it looks to me like for a while that it was being, most of the money coming out of his account comes through the claims, it doesn't even come through my office. But it looks like sub-funds could probably clear most of it up, to me, if for each different branch you had a sub-fund, then it would be up to Scott to let us know which money's going into that sub-fund, which money's coming out of it. That looks like it would be kind of the easiest fix to me,
Okay.
but,
Do you wanna, go ahead.
That would clear it up a lot quicker. It would clear it up a lot quicker.
and it looks like it was being done for a while, and I don't know what, why that procedure stopped. I think that was something that was being done through the finance office, when the grants were set up. But, yeah, I think there was like a 401 and a 501 sub-fund in there. There was 3 different sub-funds that we were looking at. If you had a sub-fund, you'd know exactly which grant. I mean, when you have grant money come in, it gives you the number of the grant that comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Then it would be up to you to determine which sub-fund that grant goes to. You'd have to just keep a file folder on each grant. To me, like, that would be the easiest way to do it.
Well, there again, I think everything was
Thanks,
done
Doug.
that way, like he said, except for like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation grants. And then there was some of the Noxious Weed Trust and the state grants that weren't ever separated either. So I guess, looking at this recommendations, we'll just kind of have to dig into, moving forward and how we can do that. And then even if we have this, say like the state funds, like subcategories under both revenues and expenditures from this point forward. so.
Yeah, it'll definitely help with tracking for the noxious weed. Just- Those are restricted, so keeping them as separate as possible is the best way to go.
Which makes good sense too. I mean, it's kind of common sense. And the more clear it is, keep it simple. Yeah. So Doug, if we get you, copies of both of these, do you want an opportunity, if you have any comments, to submit those to Scott too?
Yeah.
Okay, just if you see something that you wanna comment on for the draft report. Thanks.
I'll forward them to you as well then. I'll forward, the email to you as well.
All right, anything else from the board?
I mean,
Anything else from Scott? Ladies?
No, I think that's it.
All right, well, thank you very much for all the help on this. This is invaluable.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks to Scott for all of his hard work on this too. He was very helpful in trying to get this all worked out. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Well, happy New Year.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks, ladies, and
Thank
Scott.
you.
Thank you.
And Doug, thanks for coming up. Thanks for your input.
And your mom as well.
Thanks.
Anything else for the good of the order?
I think that this is gonna be a help,
I do too. Yeah.
but I think it's really important that it says when Scott's hire date was. Because then you look at it, you're going, oh,
Right,
man, you know,
yeah,
a lot of it was before he was the coordinator, and,
yeah.
it clears up a lot of stuff.
Sometimes things can seem to point one way, but when you get a little bit more detail, they point a totally different way. So, yeah, I think that's good input. So our deadlines are Thursday at noon for any comments. To go to Scott, so we can forward those on. He'll be our point person. So anything else for the good of the order? All right. Without any objection, this meeting is adjourned.
Question for you.
Thank you.
Do those grants have a grant administrator on any of those grants, and generally who's?
We don't have a grant administrator per se. All grants are administrated through the finance office, and it's part of the county budget. You'll see it when you look in your budget sheets. At the end of every department, there is a listing of the different grants that department has. Weed, I think, has probably got the most.
But it's up to Doug's office to,
The finance office actually is not part of the clerk, recorder, treasurer. Doug was here just as a courtesy, but he is not the one who puts together the finances. That is the finance office duty, finance officer's duty. That isn't Doug's. He would be more the treasurer's side.
okay.
So the two are totally separate. All right, we are, good.
Franklin, I wanted to thank you for your vote of confidence.
So one more question on that grant
This is great.
administrator.
well,
If it's handled through the finance office, then why would Mako be doing, be adding this finance officer or grant administrator on the
I know it,
$15,000 grant?
but I just,
Both ways can doing anything for a grant.
and I thought doctors
$50,000
get out.
grant that the hospital
I'll
had?
stick it up, but I can't reach.
No, that MACO has nothing to do with that. MACO is Montana Association of Counties.
Yeah.
Right.
And they are a resource for us to use, questions and.
Forever and ever and ever.
They have
But don't
nothing-
they also offer grant administration?
Mr. West asked me for this. Are you gonna be seeing Mr. West?
I can't.
Yeah, you bet.
Are you wondering about him? No, no, no.
Impact, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes,
Yeah.
That's
Initial
business.
impact, Mako.
Yeah.